All right, ladies and gentlemen, for our next podcast on ecology, we're going to talk about the abiotic factors in an environment. So the things that affect the living things in the environment, but are not living themselves. What you'll learn when you start to focus on all of the aspects of environment, particularly those that are not alive, is that the non-living factors tend to be about cycles. Now, you all know that, as a species, we strive to recycle as much as possible because we are using up all these natural resources and we don't want to run out of them. Well, nature is very similar in that regard. Nature has resources, and those resources can be used up. And so nature has this methodology for removing these resources from things that are no longer using them and then providing them to the things that are using them. And so that's where we get these abiotic factors and these cycles. Now, specifically, we're going to focus on three cycles: the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and then the nitrogen cycle. Now, hopefully, you realize why water is very important. All living things exist in water. Even human beings like yourself are just a big walking sack of water. Carbon, again, hopefully you realize it's important because it's the single most important molecule to life. Remember, we talked about this earlier in the year: carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur. And what's the first one that we write there? C, which is for carbon. So it kind of makes sense that we have a cycle that shows how carbon is recycled through the environment. Finally, we're going to talk about nitrogen, which again you'll see is another one of those elements. Now, there's also a phosphorus cycle and other cycles, but we're mostly concerned with these three right now as exemplars as to how this cycling process works. So here you see a diagram of the first cycle we're going to discuss, the water cycle. Now, the diagram looks immediately complex, okay? But what you have to understand, all right, is that we're concerned with two basic things, all right? Water getting into the atmosphere and water getting back to the ground. So right off the bat, you need to realize that water can exist as a gas, as a liquid, and as a solid, okay? Now, water as a gas is in the environment. So basically what happens is you have all this water in the oceans. Now, we can't drink that water because it has salt in it. But what happens is the heat from the sun evaporates that water. It provides it enough energy that the water, which was a liquid, becomes a gas. And that gas then rises into the atmosphere. As it rises into the atmosphere, a couple things happen. The gas gets colder because it's colder the farther you get away from the surface of the planet. And it starts to collect near each other, and that's what starts to form clouds. Now, you can see here, you've got all these clouds and they move all over. And then right here, you have this key idea of precipitation. So eventually, the water in the clouds, there's too much of it, it gets too heavy, the temperature changes too drastically, and the water falls out of the clouds, no longer as gas, but now as a liquid. And that water ends up in streams, in rivers. It ends up being the ever so important fresh water. And you can see that this ends up, traveling through streams. It can end up landing on high mountains and freezing. It can end up being absorbed into the water and becoming underground fresh water. But no matter what, eventually that water ends up back in the ocean. Okay. Even here in freshwater, you can see that there are underground levees that lead it back to the ocean. And then once it's back to that ocean, it ends up getting evaporated by the sun, rises into the atmosphere, and it collects again and falls. And it is in this way that water is recycled through the environment. And this is very important. All living things need fresh water. And so if this process did not happen, removing the fresh water from the salty ocean, allowing it to collect in the sky, precipitate, and end up in all of these places: snow and ice, freshwater lakes, freshwater streams, underground aquifers, and groundwater flow places, we would not have water for organisms to survive. So that's the basics of the water cycle. Sun evaporates the water, ends up in the atmosphere. and eventually it precipitates back down. So water cycle is evaporation, precipitation, and runoff. Okay? Now the carbon cycle is in some ways a little simpler, but also a little more complicated. So the carbon cycle is basically dependent on a couple of things. It is based upon organic molecules, which hopefully you remember are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And they include things like carbohydrates. It includes things like lipids, nucleic acids, and also amino acids. Okay. Now, the other main aspect of the carbon cycle, now please understand, there's lots of ways carbon can exist. But the other main aspect of the carbon cycle is carbon dioxide, okay? So that's what CO2 is, it's carbon dioxide. So what happens is animals undergo cellular respiration. Hopefully you remember cellular respiration is the process of your body taking in sugars and converting them to energy that you need to function in the form of ATP, and converting them to carbon dioxide waste, which you exhale. Well, here's the big thing. Everything that undergoes cellular respiration must exhale carbon dioxide. Not everything does it like you do with breathing in and out. Plants give off carbon dioxide. Insects don't necessarily breathe the same way you do, but they give off carbon dioxide. So every organism that gives off carbon dioxide, see here, animals, it goes up into the atmosphere. Plants, it goes up into the atmosphere. Okay? The roots down here goes up into the atmosphere. Now, what happens is, if you recall, photosynthesis requires carbon dioxide and water. So here you have sunlight going down for photosynthesis, and here's all that carbon dioxide that was just given off by the atmosphere. So animals breathing off, plants breathing off, all like the roots of plants giving stuff off, whether it be the fungi or the bacteria, all that carbon dioxide goes into the atmosphere, and the plants take it out. The plants remove that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and then they convert it into sugar and oxygen, which the plants and animals then use, which gives off more carbon dioxide. Now, we also have a couple things. So here you have over here, it says decaying organisms. Well, remember, organisms are made of organic macromolecules. So what happens is these organisms have their carbon molecules used, like they end up like in the soil and they get used by other organisms. So, you know, if you've ever unfortunately stumbled upon a dead animal, what you will watch, if you watched it for long enough, is that slowly the animal starts to go away. Well, the animal's not vanishing. Insects, bacteria, microorganisms like fungi, all these things are eating the animal. They are taking the carbon that's in that animal and using it for themselves. And in fact, they will use it for themselves until they die and something takes it from them. And their carbon will also get put up back into the atmosphere when they respirate. Now, occasionally some organisms, and you see this down here, end up trapped so far below the ground or in such unique places that they actually never get reused by other organisms. And over time, they get compressed into this liquid of just carbons and hydrogens and oxygens. And that is oil. So when I tell you that all the energy on the earth comes from the sun, I'm not kidding, because even fuel, like heating oil or car gasoline, is the leftover remains of organisms that died millions of years ago and had their carbon smushed into this gross liquid that contains all of this energy and was stored underground. Now, the one complication to this process is when we use that oil. You can see what I just circled says auto and factory emissions. What's happened in the last 100 years or so, probably a little bit less than that, as the human beings have entered the industrial age, we started to burn fossil fuels. Well, fossil fuels are made of carbon. So if you burn fossil fuels, you give off carbon dioxide. And so what's happened is, up here in the atmosphere, you have all this carbon dioxide. And there's so much carbon dioxide that the plants can't take it out fast enough. Which obviously is complicated when we continuously cut down plants to build houses and other wooden structures, to make paper. And so now we have all this carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that we're adding extra on top of all that we breathe. And you have all these plants that we're taking away that can't take the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere acts a little bit like glass. I'm sure all of you have been in a car in a hot summer day, like yesterday or today or tomorrow. And what happens is that heat from inside the car, when you open that door, it's like a sauna. And that's because all the energy from the sunlight goes through the glass windows of your car. It hits the seats, it hits the steering wheel, it hits the dashboard, it hits the floor, and it goes to bounce out and the glass traps some of it back in there. It makes it hotter. That's something that we actually call the greenhouse effect. Light can get through, but when it goes to bounce back out, more of it gets trapped than it's supposed to. And that actually happens in the atmosphere when we fill it with carbon dioxide. And that's what's causing what we call global climate change. Now here we have our last cycle. Our last cycle, again, similar process of what's going on here. Organisms give off, other organisms take in, organisms use. The only complicating here is the nitrogen cycle, and this is going to be our big difference here. The nitrogen cycle requires bacteria. Okay, so the nitrogen cycle requires bacteria. So what happens is there's not lots of nitrogen in the atmosphere. In fact, the majority of the atmosphere, as you know it, is nitrogen. Okay, and organisms require nitrogen. And what you have is, and you can see this over here, there are bacteria that absorb nitrogen. See how it says nitrogen-fixing bacteria? And they tend to live with plants. And so what they do is they take in the nitrogen, they convert it to something that the plants can use, and the plants take it in and turn it into things like amino acids and other organic macromolecules. Then what happens is, animals like Mr. Bunny over here who eat the plants get the nitrogen that they require. And then when they die, when the plants die, you have bacteria and fungi here that are decomposing it, and they turn that nitrogen into ammonia. And then what you have here is you have what's called nitrifying bacteria, which take that ammonia and eventually turn it into atmospheric nitrogen. So basically you have bacteria and some fungi are necessary to allow the nitrogen cycle to actually function the way that it's supposed to. All right, so those are the basics of cycles in an environment. Just remember, biotic factors in an environment are all about the relationships between organisms, and abiotic factors in an environment are all about how the factors are recycled so that they can be used in perpetuity.